My name is Eric Gaskell, and you're listening to the Distorted History Podcast.
To speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
I can give you merry tales and joyous laughter.
Shameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror.
A long struggle for freedom.
It really is a revolution.
Politicians, police, newspapers, and newscasts all like to talk about crime, and in doing so use it to scare people as they claim that crime rates are skyrocketing even when the exact opposite is the case. Strangely enough, though, American culture, despite this fear of crime, also has a tendency to glorify the criminal. Something that on the surface at least seems very confusing, as heroes in a society are typically chosen and glorified as representing some kind of idealized social value. Take George Washington, for example. As complicated as his actual legacy might have been, he's been canonized as this larger-than-life figure who, according to legend, was almost incapable of telling a lie. In contrast, then, it seems weird to turn outlaws into legendary figures when, by their very definition, their lives were lived in defiance of the norms and laws of society. Sociologist Paul Kuwistra has, in response to this phenomenon, proposed three possible explanations. The first of which is psychological. In this explanation, outlaws are glorified because it allows the greater populace to live vicariously through their stories. This suggests the legendary outlaw figures are kind of a safety valve where such aggressive and rebellious impulses can be poured into and played out vicariously. Kuwistra, however, argues that while compelling, this theory does not explain why certain criminals are glorified while others are not. The second potential explanation he posits is cultural. In this theory, criminals are selected to symbolize certain values. They're then made heroic because they're linked to certain ideals. Sure, they might be criminals, but they're also clever, or they're courageous, or they're loyal, or even rebellious in a way that can be glorified. Again, though, many criminals could potentially receive such labels, and indeed some of the most glorified criminals aren't the most successful. The James Gang, for example, likely made less money throughout their entire career than any number of bank robbers operating in eastern cities were able to steal in a single job. Plus, the outlaws who most frequently get glorified died young in violent ways, which, by definition, meant they weren't all that successful in their endeavors. Which criminals are or are not glorified then often comes down to who they victimized and how. They can't be seen as victimizing the innocent or the vulnerable. The glorified mythical criminal has to be seen as primarily targeting those who can be argued were deserving of such extra legal retribution. And even then, when these outlaw stories are told, certain parts often get left out when they don't quite fit in with the heroic narrative. The problem with the cultural explanation Kuwistra argues is that it just kind of accepts these stories at face value and doesn't question why outlaws are being glorified and why their stories are being selected and cherry-picked in this way. This explanation also tends to ignore that the heroic outlaw, the Robin Hood-style figure, is not uniquely American by any stretch. Indeed, criminals are glorified all over the world and all throughout history, so trying to examine this phenomenon through a uniquely American cultural lens doesn't quite work. Which is why he prefers the sociological explanation that argues that the tales of heroic outlaws are a product of structural conditions. In this explanation, the glorified criminals, who are often made to look like Robin Hood-like figures, appear at times when people are extremely disillusioned. These are times of unrest that are a result of any number of causes, like economic depression, war, political corruption, and rapid social change. Criminals seem to be glorified during such times of extreme upheaval. During such times, especially when people are struggling to have their basic needs met, they often tend to feel themselves betrayed by society and the law, and thus outside of it. They see society and the law then not as serving justice, but as serving corrupt interest. As a result, those individuals who are actively working outside the law are then seen as rebels, not only against the law, but against the corrupt interest wielding it. Kuwistra also notes that such heroic criminals have a tendency to appear in more rural and agricultural regions. For America, this manifests in many of our bandit heroes coming out of the Midwest and or similarly rural regions. The outlaws that seemingly tend to be turned into heroes then are the ones whose perceived victims are the ones who are seen as oppressing the local workers and farmers. For example, during the time period we're focusing on for this story, railroads and various other corporate monopolies were growing wealthier and wealthier at the expense of the poor. They and their banking allies then were seen as obvious examples of systematic corruption and injustice. Railroads, for example, while they benefited people by connecting distant locales, they also took advantage of this dependency by squeezing small communities for concessions and threatening to cut them off if they didn't acquiesce to their demands. Then there were the various land monopolies that were known to buy up huge swaths of the countryside to squeeze out small farmers who could not compete. They were known to run people out of their homes and even kill those who resisted. Now, it should be noted that these so-called legendary outlaw figures were not actually connected to any political movement. Indeed, the leaders of populist movements who rallied against those same forces often did not see the criminals as allies. If anything, they tended to speak out against them and often felt that the glorification of such individuals was ultimately counter to their goals, as people could potentially feel some sort of measure of justice against their enemies vicariously through the actions of these outlaws without achieving any actual structural change. These political leaders also feared that even the perceived connection between their movements and such criminal activity would then allow the more powerful moneyed forces to recast their complaints as questionable and less legitimate due to these criminal connections. For American history in particular, there seem to be three specific periods when these glorified outlaw figures arose: the 1870s, the 1890s, and finally the 1930s. These were notably all times of extreme economic depression that affected the entire country. Times in which the widespread economic hardship also went hand in hand with visible political corruption. The 1930s, for example, the era of gangsters and outlaws like Al Capone, Pretty Boy Floyd, John Dillinger, Machine Gun Kelly, and Bonnie and Clyde, was also the era of Prohibition and the Great Depression, a time where, in addition to the extreme economic hardship, the corruption of politicians and the cops was plain for all to see. Similarly, the 1870s, the first outbreak of the mythical outlaw phenomenon in the US, was also known as the Great Depression, but has since been renamed the Long Depression as a result of the 1930s depression claiming that name. The Long Depression started in September 1873 and then lasted until 1878-79. During which time individuals like Billy the Kid, the Younger Brothers, Belle Starr, and Frank and Jesse James all became popular figures and folk heroes of sorts. Notably, following the end of this depression, there doesn't seem to have been any really glorified outlaw figures of note for about 20 years, until we reach the 1890s, the time of Butch Cassidy and the Wild Bunch among others, a period affected by the Panic of 1893, which I laid out in brief at the end of the last episode. The Panic of 1893 had caused a severe economic downturn for the entire country, and many came to see politicians and the various moneyed interests supporting them as the real robbers. They saw the laws being used to exploit the common folk so the rich could continue to live off the labor of the people. A time which saw papers like the Helena Democrat Independent write headlines like, quote, "How Coal Trust Robbers Loot Their Miners. Hannah, President McKinley's close friend and advisor, and his friends pay miners less than $1 a day for work. Hold them up in many ways." Clearly indicating that in the opinion of the paper, the real bandits who were holding people up and robbing them were the mine owners and their allies. In times like this and other periods where outlaws are made into mythical figures, historian Kent Stackmaster has suggested the law comes to, quote, "represent a social system in which injustice is the rule." As such, those seen as operating outside of the system and the law are potentially seen as heroic. In addition to operating in such times of desperation and corruption, Paul Caruster identified some of the criteria apparently necessary for criminals to be turned into these heroic Robin Hood-esque figures. For example, he states that the outlaw in question has to have some characteristic that allows them to be presented as the folk who were being victimized by the rich/powerful/corrupt at the time. They also importantly had to be able to be portrayed as the quote-unquote common folk, i.e. not members of some perceived deviant subculture. In other words, the outlaws to be turned into legendary figures had to, in one way or another, be seen as identifiable or relatable to a large number of people. In contrast, their victims, the people they were robbing, had to be seen as enemies of the common folk. In other words, they had to be seen as robbing from the types of people and institutions who couldn't be seen as the kind of corrupted forces that were destroying life for the common folk. Then, of course, there is the nature of the criminal acts, or just how outside the norm their criminal deeds were. In other words, the more violent and more deviant the nature of the crimes, the less likely one is to be seen as a potentially heroic or mythological figure. All of this is in part the result of these myths often being created by the media and the public kind of working in tandem. News organizations, after all, were looking to sell papers and the like, and in doing so, the stories that they wrote glorifying these outlaws had to be accepted and received as such by the public. Now, these myths generally had tropes, and the stories about these criminals were then forced to fit into them. As such, these outlaws were not depicted as killing or even harming the innocent. Indeed, they were only said to react with violence when their own lives were on the line. Also, they were only depicted as stealing from the wealthy oppressors and not from the common folk. Indeed, some tales even depict these outlaws of doing the whole Robin Hood thing and actually giving away their ill-gotten loot to the poor. Tales which for the most part just typically aren't true for really any of these so-called legendary outlaws. That being said, when it comes to Butch and Sundance in particular, some of these might be more true than you would expect. Now, first off, I've seen no evidence that they did the full Robin Hood thing of redistributing the wealth. They also didn't just steal from the wealthy. Granted, when they robbed trains, it could be seen as robbing from rich, evil corporations and the like. Indeed, they seemingly made a point of never even trying to rob the passengers on the trains they were holding up, focusing purely on the express cars. However, when they targeted banks and workers' payroll, that doesn't seem to fit the narrative so neatly, as they were essentially stealing the money the local townsfolk had deposited in the bank, or money that was supposed to pay workers, oftentimes miners. In which cases, I'm not entirely clear who was hurt, as it comes down to if the bank and or the company had the money to cover the losses and was willing to actually make up for what was stolen. Additionally, neither was necessarily forced into this life. For example, oftentimes outlaw legends suggest that the outlaws in question are only rebelling against a cruel and corrupt system, a system that oftentimes revealed its true nature to them at a young age. Butch Cassidy's first crime of stealing the overalls from the store when it was closed and being humiliated by the community even though he intended to return and pay for the overalls has sometimes been used to fit that narrative. Although perhaps since that's not a convincing enough motivation, Parley P. Christensen, a former sheriff of Juab County, Utah, claimed that somewhere between 1879 and 1884, young Bob Parker, the future Butch Cassidy, was arrested for stealing a saddle, which Parley claimed was important because while he was under arrest, young Bob was mistreated by the authorities, something which, according to this myth-making process, only deepened his mistrust of the authority of the law. That being said, no actual record exists of the arrest, so it's questionable if it even happened. For me, the most compelling case you could argue is that events like the Great Die-Up and the Panic of 1893 created conditions where work was so hard to find and pay was so low that Butch, Sundance, and others like them chose to resort to criminal activities to survive. One could argue, though, that they had a couple of opportunities to get out of the outlaw life but always went back. That being said, there is one specific point in our story where it does seem like they had honestly tried to go straight, but were forced back into being outlaws, but that's not a story for right now. Butch Cassidy's also been framed in legend as being extremely honest. You see, according to legend, Butch Cassidy had received his early release from the Wyoming penitentiary after being interviewed by the governor, during which, as the story goes, the governor offered Cassidy his release, as long as he promised he would quit rustling livestock. Cassidy, though, supposedly confessed to the governor that he could not make such a promise, as it would mean he'd have to break his word. Instead, he'd offered the governor a different promise, a promise that he would keep his criminal activities out of Wyoming. The governor then, according to this tale, was so impressed by the outlaw's honesty that he granted him his pardon. A story that very likely never happened. For one, it doesn't make much sense that Cassidy would actually admit such a thing with his freedom on the line. Plus, while the governor did indeed visit the prison where Cassidy was held, and his visit did coincide with Cassidy's release, the reality is, he'd signed the pardon 2 weeks earlier, at which point it does not seem like there's any evidence to suggest they had met. Yet, despite the facts not really backing up this tale, it would be told time and time again. While the tale of Butch Cassidy, the extremely honest outlaw, might not be true, he would be connected to another virtue, namely that of loyalty, as he was said to have been extremely loyal to his friends, which was illustrated by robbing the bank last episode to pay for Matt Waters' defense, a crime that Cassidy seemingly committed not for his own benefit, but to simply aid a friend. Now, while I will continue to touch on the various ways in which Cassidy either fit or was made to fit into this larger mythic outlaw tradition, first, like always, I want to acknowledge my sources for this series, which include Tom Hatch's The Last Outlaws, The Lives and Legends of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, Paul Kuistro's Criminals as Heroes, Structure, Power, and Identity, Richard Patterson's Butch Cassidy A Biography, Donna B. Ernst's The Sundance Kid, The Life of Harry Alonzo Longabaugh, and Charles Kelly's The Outlaw Trail, A History of Butch Cassidy and His Wild Bunch. And like always, these and any additional sources like websites that I used will be listed on this podcast Twitter and Ko-fi pages, links to which are in the description. And with all that being said, let's begin. The gang that organized itself under Butch Cassidy's leadership came to be known as the Wild Bunch, a name they apparently garnered for making a commotion in the various saloons and main streets of a number of small towns located around the borders of Wyoming, Colorado, and Utah. Basically, they came to be known and recognized as a bunch of wild cowboys. Now, the Wild Bunch has been described as a loosely organized group that might have consisted of roughly 100 or so outlaws over the years. That being said, at any given time, the gang was rarely ever larger than 10 or so members, with membership largely consisting of who Butch Cassidy needed for any given robbery. Most members of the Wild Bunch were roughly the same age. They were generally in their 30s and had typically previously worked as cowboys before turning outlaw due to the brutal winter of 1886 and 87 that had decimated the western cattle herds, or alternatively had been cut loose as a result of the Panic of 1893. Also notable about this gang is they followed and remained loyal to Cassidy not out of fear, as he actually had a reputation for being fun-loving and easygoing. Cassidy then wasn't your typical ruthless criminal by any means, as he would rather use his brain than his gun. They followed him then because he was clever, and had a reputation for being a bit of a mastermind when it came to planning robberies. You can see then some similarities to Dutch Van der Linde in Red Dead Redemption 2, as he too led a large gang of criminals, not through fear but because he was seen as clever. You see time and time again in that game the rest of the gang looking to Dutch for ideas and plans for what to do next. Butch Cassidy earned this position as he seemed to have a skill for picking the right time and place to commit a robbery, a skill which largely came down to careful planning and studying his targets first, which not only helped him to know when to hit a target so that it had the most money on hand, but also ensured they always knew how to get in and out quickly and have a good plan of escape once the job was done. They also followed him as Butch was known to be loyal to a fault, and he could be trusted to keep his head. As such, while he might enjoy a night on the town from time to time drinking and gambling, he reportedly never did it to excess. He also seemed to always keep a cool head while on the job, which plays into the most notable part of the real story of Butch and Sundance that aligns with the expectations of the mythical legendary outlaw, the refusal to harm and kill regular innocent people. Something which historian Charles Kelly would write about in 1938 as he compared these outlaws to the gangsters of his day, quote, "Riders on the outlaw trail under the leadership of Butch Cassidy live by a code of their own, a code vastly superior to anything known in the underworld of today. In comparison with modern gangsters, they were all gentlemen. To shoot an unarmed man was considered the lowest of crimes, and the abuse of women and children was never thought of at any time." To support this claim, Kelly would relate a story in his book where Cassidy was arrested by two lawmen for the theft of his neighbor and friend Jim Candleman's horses. Cassidy, though, would manage to escape, stealing the lawmen's horses in the process. As he was riding off, though, Cassidy realized that their canteens were still on their horses, and they were now stranded some 30 miles from the nearest town. So, not wanting the two men to die of thirst before reaching town, Cassidy rode back to return their canteens. A story clearly designed to paint Cassidy as this clever and noble thief, as not only did he escape capture and disarm his pursuers, but he also not only chose not to kill them with his own hands, but he even chose to go out of his way to ride back and make sure they were able to return to town safely. A story that very likely did not happen, as Cassidy was only suspected of the theft because he had departed Utah around about the same time as the theft happened, so it seems unlikely that he was caught and arrested for the crime before he reached Telluride, Colorado. That being said, this story was retold not only because it further glorified Cassidy, but because it was at least somewhat believable, considering that he did seem to be actually adverse to killing. Indeed, this was not the only time such a story was told about Butch Cassidy, as according to his fellow Telluride bank robber Matt Warner, when they were leaving their hideout in Robber's Roost to evade one of the posses who were pursuing them, the outlaws were able to elude capture by running back along the trail and hiding behind some rocks. From their hiding spot, they then watched as 3 riders, one of whom they recognized as a local lawman, ride past their location, which was exactly what they wanted. However, they couldn't help but note how the 3 riders a little ways down the trail veered off and started heading in a direction that would take them straight into the desert and sure death. Now, at this point, the outlaws had effectively tricked the lawmen and eluded capture. Yet, according to Warner, the 3 outlaws, including himself and Butch Cassidy, couldn't just let these men ride off to their slow, inevitable deaths, even if they were pursuing them. So, even though they were risking their own freedom, Warner claims to have fired his gun, thereby getting the attention of the 3 riders, at which point he waved his hat in motioning for them to follow. The outlaws then led their pursuers to water, which the lawmen eagerly took advantage of. Then, according to Warner at least, after he allowed the lawmen to get a drink and eat some of the food he provided them with, he gave them orders to drop their guns and raise their hands. The outlaws then had the lead lawman remove his pants before allowing him to mount his horse and ride back to town. A story, especially that last bit, I find hard to swallow. I especially find it suspicious how Warner makes himself the main character throughout. That being said, the similarities in these stories about providing the lawmen hunting them with water to survive suggest that either these types of stories were common at the time and were simply retold with these outlaws being a part of it, or there might be some grain of truth that somewhere along the line these outlaws did perform some kind of act like this. Yet, regardless of how true any of these individual stories are, it does seem to be that the policy of the Wild Bunch under the leadership of Butch Cassidy was to avoid violence as much as possible. Instead, the preference was to use negotiation and intimidation to accomplish their goals, a stance that both Butch and Sundance appeared to strictly follow. Additionally, they also made a point to never rob, much less even harass the passengers on the trains they were robbing, instead focusing purely on the contents of the express car. Now, Cassidy's specific aversion to killing, according to legend at least, dates back to his days racing horses with Matt Warner and Tom McCarty. You see, apparently one time the trio raced their unbeatable horse against a group of Native Americans, betting as they did so, among other things, their blankets and their horses. Cassidy and Warner's horse then won the race like it always did, thereby also winning them the horse the Native Americans had raced with. The Native Americans, however, suddenly balked at this exchange. This led to Tom McCarty assaulting one of the Native Americans, which then necessitated his partners Cassidy and Warner to draw their rifles so as to extricate themselves from this situation, as the Native Americans had reportedly been about to pull their weapons in response to McCarty's actions. The 3 men then left the area, but were tracked down by the Native Americans, who were apparently not so much interested in resuming their fight as they more wanted to try and work out a deal to get their horse back. The 3 white men weren't interested in negotiating, however, feeling that they had won the horse fair and square. One of the Native Americans, in response to this flat refusal to negotiate, then aimed his rifle at Tom McCarty, who responded by drawing his own revolver and shooting the Native American off his horse, killing him on the spot. A sight which Cassidy's sister Lula believes made him sick, and indeed it was quite possible this was the first person he had ever seen shot and killed. Now, how true this story is, and if it is the source of Cassidy's apparent avoidance of bloodshed, we can't really say. All we do know is that it does not seem like Cassidy ever killed anyone until the very end of his life. That all being said, while Butch and Sundance themselves seem to have strict rules about violence and killing, not all of the outlaws that rode with them seem to have the same aversion. For example, there was Harvey Logan, who was also known as Kid Curry. Now, Logan was not a large man, standing just 5'7" and weighing 140 pounds, but he had a reputation for being very dangerous. Harvey first killed a man in Montana after starting a fight with him. Now, this man was larger and older than Harvey. Plus, he had a reputation for being a bare-knuckled fighter, and yet despite all this, the man was still losing to Logan. Fearing then that the smaller and more aggressive Harvey was about to beat him to death, this other man reached for his pistol, but it misfired. Logan then responded by pulling his own gun and killing the man right then and there. Now, while that specific killing seems difficult to figure out the degree to which his actions were justified, that was only the first life the so-called Kid Curry took. As throughout his career as an outlaw, there were 15 warrants for Harvey Logan's arrest due to murder, and it's believed he had killed at least twice as many people. At the same time, though, by all accounts, Logan could be charming and polite, and was also known to treat women with respect regardless of their occupation. Then there was Patrick Lewis Johnson, who was also known as Swede, even though he was not Swedish. I don't know what's happening here either. He too was known as a killer, and he apparently needed little provocation to do so if the events of March 1898 are any indication, as he killed 16-year-old Willie Strang, who was described as witless, suggesting he was mentally handicapped in some way, by completely emptying his guns into the 16-year-old after the boy accidentally spilled half a pitcher of water onto Swede. That was it. He got a little wet, so he murdered a teenager. There was also Harry Tracy, a friend of Swede's, which should tell you something about his character as well. Tracy had a reputation for being dangerous. Indeed, even at age 15, when he stole some geese, the lone local lawman was too afraid to make the arrest by himself. Then, later following another arrest for breaking into a home, Tracy killed a guard and escaped his labor gang, at which point he went on a crime spree that consisted of just about every crime imaginable from kidnapping to murder. Which is all to say that even though Butch and Sundance themselves might not have been killers, they still freely associated and surrounded themselves with killers. As for the numerous other members of the Wild Bunch, there were men like William Carver, who was nicknamed News, as he got a kick out of seeing his name in papers after a heist. News got to start robbing banks and trains in Texas and New Mexico as a part of the Black Jack Ketchum gang, who were eventually captured and hanged for their misdeeds. News, who apparently somehow escaped that fate, was described as happy-go-lucky, except when he was drinking, at which point he tended to turn moody and dangerous. Then there was Ben the tall Texan Kilpatrick, who stood 6'2" and was known for his good nature and practical jokes. He was also slow to pull his gun and always ordered ham and beans for dinner because he could not read the menu. Still, he was known to be quite handsome and thus quite popular with women. Meanwhile, also in the gang was Laughing Sam Carey, a train and bank robber who earned his nickname because he never smiled. Walter Puntney, who had taken part in the Belle-Fourche bank robbery and had escaped jail along with Sundance, was another member of the gang. His specialty was reconnaissance, as he was able to easily blend in anywhere. Then there was Bill Cruxon, a Texan who stood just 5'1" tall. He had a reputation for being the best horse thief in the Wild Bunch, who knew every spot where stolen horses could be hidden, while also being an expert at covering his trail. The gang was also aided by one Jesse Lindsley, who, while he had a past as a horse thief, had little interest in actually robbing trains. However, since he worked for a railroad, he was able to supply the gang with inside information about their procedures. There were also women connected to or potentially even a part of the gang. For example, there was Laura Bullion, who was known as the Rose of the Wild Bunch, who at different times was involved with News Carver and Ben the tall Texan Kilpatrick. Then there was Ann Bassett, who was reportedly Butch Cassidy's romantic companion from time to time. Ann, however, wasn't just infatuated with bad boys. She could hold her own, as she and her older sister Josie, despite getting educated in a prominent boarding school in Boston, had also been taught how to shoot, ride, rope, spin, and curse by their father, making them the match of any man in all categories. Indeed, when the Bassett family refused to sell their property to some wealthy ranchers, and said ranchers hired rustlers to try and put the family out of business, the two women reportedly responded by stealing livestock from the ranchers targeting them. Meanwhile, their mother, Elizabeth Bassett, was said to have been almost like an older sister or even a mother to the gang as a whole, and Butch and Sundance in particular. Speaking of Sundance, he was not as outgoing and personable as Cassidy. Indeed, he was more known to be moody, shy, and even quick-tempered. That being said, those who got to know him found Sundance to be very friendly, likable, and willing to stand up for his friends. He was also known as the fastest gun in the West, which likely wasn't accurate, but he did apparently develop a very quick draw. Yet despite this, like Cassidy, Sundance didn't appear to have any real interest in killing, which is potentially one of the things that bonded the two men, in addition to their similar backgrounds. As I covered in episode 1, both had deeply religious mothers, both had experience working as cowboys, both had an affinity for horses, and both were well read. All of which is likely part of the reason why Cassidy reportedly trusted Sundance to be his sounding board for ideas. Yet while these two seem to have been the leaders of the Wild Bunch, with Cassidy in particular acting as the primary planner, it wasn't a dictatorial type of gang where they gave orders and expected the others to follow. Instead, they welcomed the opinions and ideas of the others. So while the final plan was ultimately Cassidy's, the others were given the chance to feel involved, and thus were more likely to follow along with the plan as a result of this process. A setup that was reportedly fairly unique among such Western outlaw gangs. Now, Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch were not the only gang operating in the region around where Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah connect. Indeed, it got to the point that the various robberies, holdups, and the surprisingly large amount of livestock being stolen in the region became such an issue that the governors of those states, at the behest of the major cattle barons in the region, held a meeting in March of 1898, during which time they announced their intentions to cooperate with one another to bring down the various outlaw gangs operating in the region. Multiple plans were discussed as to how they might accomplish this goal. One such plan consisted of surrounding Browns Park with a large force that would then systematically move in and kill any man who could not, quote, give a good accounting of himself. That plan, however, was deemed a bit impractical, but not because of the rampant and widespread killing that was likely to result. No, their issue was more a question of manpower and cost. So instead of a huge force that could completely surround Browns Park, they talked about a plan utilizing 15 lawmen, 5 from each state, who would take up positions on the roads leading into and out of Browns Park. Each of these men then would be given the authority to kill on sight any man they deemed suspicious. Yet before the governors could agree to such a plan, the country became distracted by the sinking of the battleship Maine and the subsequent war against Spain. Talk in the region then shifted to forming regiments of cowboys to join the war effort. Indeed, legend even had it that the Wild Bunch held a meeting to discuss joining up themselves. That being said, it's not actually known if such a meeting ever took place, and even if it did, it very likely was more motivated by the potential to exchange their services for pardons than anything else. Legend also has it that Cassidy attempted to aid the war effort in another way. You see, railroads and express companies had responded to train robberies by demanding that states provide them with militia forces to counter the bandits, forces that theoretically could be better used elsewhere given that the country was at war. In response to this situation, Cassidy allegedly sent a message to the governor of Wyoming to assure him that such efforts need not be taken, as he promised that his gang would not be robbing trains anytime soon. Now, if this promise was even made, it clearly was not believed, as efforts to stop the outlaws were ramped up regardless during this time, with Cassidy in particular seeming to be a prime target. Indeed, one bounty hunter was dispatched after the outlaw gang leader, but came up empty. Meanwhile, a Carbon County posse that had been dispatched to track down some stolen livestock had quite a bit more luck, as in their search they happened to come across a quartet of bandits. 2 of the bandits surrendered immediately and were arrested, while the other 2 fought back and were killed in the resulting firefight. One of whom was then identified as the infamous Butch Cassidy, much to the delight of the authorities. Suspiciously, though, the man who'd been captured alongside the now-dead Butch Cassidy kept insisting that the dead man wasn't him, but a cowboy from Wyoming. It would then take a lawman who had actually encountered Cassidy in the past to view the body and confirm that the dead man, in fact, was not the infamous Butch Cassidy. A situation which, according to legend, Cassidy himself found to be quite entertaining, and an opportunity he could not pass up. As the story goes, Cassidy felt it appropriate to attend his own funeral once in his lifetime, so he laid down in the back of a wagon under some hay and hid there, peeking out as the wagon drove into town and past a building that supposedly contained his lifeless body. Yet regardless of if this story was true or just stolen from a Mark Twain novel, the fact remained that Cassidy and his gang had become a target. As a result, their old reliable hideouts of Browns Park and Robber's Roost were no longer as safe as they used to be, what with the authorities in the region suddenly very motivated to capture and kill them. The outlaws then departed the region, and in a possible attempt to take the heat off of themselves for a time, they laid low hoping not to attract any attention. Butch Cassidy and LZ Lay, for example, ended up working actual jobs on the WS Ranch in southwestern New Mexico, a region somewhat similar to Browns Park, in that the populace weren't exactly what you would call eager to help the authorities when it came to tracking down fugitives. A situation that worked out well for the members of the Wild Bunch and the man who was running the WS Ranch, William French, who just wanted his employees to be hardworking and loyal. As long as they met that criteria, their past and their other activities, it seems, were none of his business. As such, French didn't really bother to investigate or even just question if Jim Lowe was the real name of the cowboy he hired, or if he might be more well known by another name, like say Butch Cassidy. Instead, all French cared about was how skilled and what a good leader this man was, and so he made him a trail boss, meaning that when it came time to lead the cattle down the 200 or so mile trail to the railroad, Jim Lowe was the unquestioned boss leading this effort. A job that Lowe/Cassidy did flawlessly, as he managed to get every single one of the cattle under his charge to their destination in a neat and orderly fashion. Indeed, both Cassidy and Elsie, who was brought on primarily to break Broncos, were reportedly quite good at their jobs. Yet, just because they were seemingly living a normal, quiet life does not mean they had given up their lives as outlaws. Cassidy had plans, you see. After all, his original idea for the gang's name was the Train Robbers Syndicate, indicating that while he might have had an aptitude for planning robberies, Butch Cassidy wasn't great at marketing, as that name had no chance of catching on, even if the much better Wild Bunch moniker wasn't an option. Now, trains at this point were no longer the marvels of cutting-edge technology that they once had been. That being said, they were a huge deal economically, which only really happened with the creation of the Transcontinental Railroad, as prior to its construction, trains primarily ran on short lines that connected neighboring cities, and that was oftentimes as far as they could go, as initially there was no standard gauge for rails or how wide the tracks were, which meant that while a train could easily move up and down its own set of rails, it might not be able to link up with another rail line unless they shared the same gauge and width. In such cases, passengers and or cargo had to be completely taken off of one train to board another to continue on toward their destination. Additionally, the Eastern rail lines only went so far, to Omaha, Nebraska specifically. Anything going farther than that had to be loaded onto wagons and hauled by horse or oxen. What ultimately spurred the creation of a continent-spanning railroad was the discovery of gold in California and the subsequent gold rush it spawned. The Central Pacific Railroad and the Union Pacific Railroad were then granted massive loans and government grants to carry out this process, work that was finally completed on the 10th of May 1869 at Promontory Summit in Utah. These railroads then profited massively and also became incredibly influential as a result. Communities fed off of and were even created by these railroads, which gave them immense power to make demands and receive concessions from these communities. These railroads were so influential, in fact, that they are the reason why we have established time zones. Back in the day, you see, each town apparently set their own clocks independently according to the sun, a situation that caused confusion with train schedules. To remedy this situation in 1883, the railroads implemented standardized time zones that are still in place today. Trains then were literal engines of the economy and carried significant amounts of wealth from one location to another. As such, they were tempting targets for men like Butch Cassidy, who may have robbed his first train back in November of 1887. A heist that at the time likely would have been the idea of Tom McCarty, who was introducing his partners in horse racing, Matt Warner and Bob Parker, the future Butch Cassidy, to his brand of outlaw behavior. Now, as is so often the case with this story, since the outlaws didn't exactly leave behind a detailed record of their crimes, what with them being crimes and all, we can't say for sure if Cassidy and his two companions were actually involved or not. What we do know is that on the 3rd of November 1887, 3 men boarded a train that was stopped 5 miles east of Grand Junction, Colorado, at a spot known as Unaweep Switch. The 3 men would then stop the train and enter the express car where the most valuable cargo was held in safes. Unfortunately for the bandits, though, the express manager in the car insisted that only the station master actually knew the combination to the safe, which is the same problem Sundance had run into on his first attempted train robbery. Indeed, much like Sundance, these outlaws had no dynamite to remedy the situation, so they only made off with $150 and some odd bits of registered mail. Now, as to whether or not McCarty, Warner, and Parker/Cassidy were 3 of the 5 men believed to have been involved in this robbery, for what it's worth, 4 completely different men were eventually arrested and convicted for this crime, which could mean they were not involved, and legend and rumor of their involvement is wrong. Or it could mean the authorities captured and convicted the wrong men. A similar story would unfold when on the 14th of July 1898, a Southern Pacific passenger train departed from Humboldt, Nevada, a former mining town. Unbeknownst to the crew operating the locomotive, as the train was pulling away, 2 men hopped onto one of its cars and began making their way up to the engine compartment, where upon entering with guns drawn, they ordered both the engineer and firemen to pull the train to a stop at an upcoming milepost where the companion was waiting with their horses. After doing as they were told, the train's crew were led back to the express car where the valuables would be held, at which point they ordered the man inside said car, a man named Hughes, to open up. Hughes refused, and so the outlaws responded to this defiance by setting off a stick of dynamite near the train as a warning of sorts, which was apparently enough to convince Hughes to open the door. Once they were inside, then the outlaws stuck another stick of dynamite atop the safe. The resulting explosion both effectively opened the safe and destroyed the interior of the express car. The three outlaws believed to have been Sundance and two members of the amorphous Wild Bunch then entered the wrecked car with bags covering their boots so as to obscure their boot prints and took from the safe some $26,000 in cash and jewelry. Now, as all this was happening, the unexpected stop had caused the train's rear brakemen to wonder what exactly was going on, as trains are, after all, not supposed to stop in the middle of nowhere. It didn't take him long then to figure out what was happening, at which point he took off on foot back to Humboldt, where he sounded the alarm, which included sending a telegraph onto the next stop, alerting the sheriff there of the robbery. The sheriff then quickly started putting a posse together. He even had a special train assembled on which they could be quickly carried out to the site of the robbery to capture the bandits. Yet even with this quicker than normal notice, by the time the posse arrived, the outlaws had already departed 2 hours earlier after claiming their stolen goods and reportedly shaking hands with the train's crew. A sizable bounty of $1,000 was placed onto the head of the three outlaws, and while 3 men would eventually be arrested for this crime, the Pinkertons remained convinced that those were not the actual criminals responsible. Instead, they blamed the Sundance Kid and 2 members of the Wild Bunch, Harvey Logan and George Flatnose Curry, who was so named because his nose was flat due to a lack of cartilage. That being said, seeing as how this was coming from the Pinkertons, it's best to take their involvement with a grain of salt. Regardless of the Wild Bunch's involvement in this particular train robbery, it does seem to be generally accepted that they were involved in one that took place nearly a year later, when on the 2nd of June 1899, as rain was coming down just a little after 2 a.m. in the morning in the vicinity of Wilcox, Wyoming, the crew of the Union Pacific Overland Flyer Section No. 1 spotted men beside the tracks waving lanterns. The train's engineer then, assuming that these men were there to warn them that the upcoming wooden bridge had been washed out by the rain, brought the engine to a halt. Now, the good news was the bridge in fact was not washed out like he feared, but the bad news was they were about to be robbed, as 2 masked men took control, ordering the engineer and firemen to pull the train across the bridge that was still very much there. However, once the train had crossed said bridge, the bandits set off the dynamite charges they had previously placed on the bridge's supports, thereby ensuring there would be no pursuit from that direction. The bandits then moved to decouple the passenger cars from the engine, baggage, mail, and express cars where all the valuables they cared about were held. In doing so, they assured the passengers that nothing was going to happen to them, provided they did as they were told and did not interfere. Once the passenger cars were decoupled, the bandits then once again ordered the engineer to drive the remaining sections of the train another 2 miles up the track, to where 4 more of their companions were waiting, with white napkins covering the lower half of their faces, while the remaining features were further concealed with burnt cork that blackened their skin. The bandits then went first for the mail car, where the clerks inside refused to open the door. The outlaws responded with dynamite, blowing said door off its hinges. Inside, however, they found nothing of any particular value, so they continued on to the express car where there were sure to be valuables. Inside this car, one Charles E. Woodcock, who despite hearing the previous explosion, still refused to open the door. So the bandits again placed a stick of dynamite underneath the door of the express car and lit the fuse. In doing so, they not only blew the door open, but made sure that there was no more door, period. The explosion also reportedly threw Woodcock back, knocking his head into the safe, likely giving him a concussion, which may explain why he was unable to open said safe, as in that moment he actually could not remember the combination. The bandits then simply turned back to their old reliable dynamite. In doing so, they apparently placed some 10 pounds of explosive atop the safe. Far too much for the job, as not only did they blow open the safe, but they also tore a hole in the side of the train car and blasted a hole through its roof. In doing so, the explosion also apparently did some damage to the contents of the safe. Namely, it damaged the corners of a number of the bills contained within. Still, despite the slight cock-up, the outlaws were able to retrieve somewhere between $30,000 to $50,000 worth of gold, diamonds, jewelry, unsigned banknotes, and cold hard cash. This had been a clearly, carefully planned out and expertly executed job, as all these events took place in under the span of 2 hours. It is believed then that Sundance and 5 members of the Wild Bunch were involved in this robbery. Now, Cassidy was reportedly not one of these men, but it is still believed that more than likely he was the mastermind of it all, with legend having it the reason why he did not participate was because the robbery had taken place in Wyoming. As such, it would have violated the promise he had supposedly made to the governor of Wyoming when petitioning for his pardon that he would commit no future crimes in his state, a story that very much plays into the myth of the honorable criminal. An honorable criminal who was also apparently comfortable with loopholes, and that while he could not actually participate in the robbery, it was still okay for him to plan it out. Again, though, it's highly unlikely any such promise was ever made, seeing as how the only time Cassidy and the governor were anywhere near each other was the day when Cassidy was released, which was 2 weeks after the governor had already signed his pardon. In response to this theft, the Union Pacific Railroad almost immediately put a $1,000 bounty on the head of each of the 6 train robbers to be paid whether they were dead or alive. An amount that was matched not only by the Pacific Express Company whose car and safety bandits had blown up and robbed, but also by the U.S. government itself. Union Pacific also dispatched a special posse train full of men, horses, supplies, and equipment to the site of the robbery, hoping to hunt down the men themselves, while they also secured the services of the Pinkerton Detective Agency, who were the ones who first began to suspect that members of Butch Cassidy's gang were responsible, due to the fact that one man, even with a mask on, was described as having an unusual nose with a flattened bridge. Additionally, 2 of the others seemed to look so much alike they might be brothers and also appeared to be part Cherokee, which likely meant these men were Harvey and Lonnie Logan, who had been involved with Sundance's escape from the Lawrence County Jail following the Belle Fourche bank robbery. As for the outlaws themselves, following the robbery, they split into several smaller groups as they made their escape, utilizing a relay of horses as was typical of a Cassidy planned job as they did so. Still, with such a large posse organized against them, it was seemingly only a matter of time before they caught up with some of the bandits. Indeed, one of these posses actually stumbled across one group of outlaws on the 5th of June near an area that would come to be known as the Teapot Dome, a location that would become infamous for being leased out to oil interests by Albert S. Fall in exchange for bribes from said interests to ensure they got the leases at a low rate. As for the posse, upon stumbling across 3 of the outlaws, a gunfight erupted between the 2 groups. A gunfight that resulted in the sheriff leading the posse, one Josiah Hazen, being mortally wounded, likely by Harvey Logan. The fact that Hazen was clearly dying seemed to break the posse's will to continue to fight, as they backed off and hunkered down in fear of a counterattack by the bandits. A choice that allowed the outlaws to, during the night, slip out of the box canyon they had unintentionally trapped themselves in and escape. Meanwhile, the members of the posse, not wanting to lose any more of their own, opted to not continue the chase. Meanwhile, also during the outlaws' flight, a local rancher would claim that the 3 men had ridden through his ranch after picking up some fresh horses nearby. Yet, while the outlaws had left the rancher and his property unmolested, one of the posses that had picked up the chase would spend the night at the same ranch. Following which, this posse that was led by several lawmen, including a U.S. Marshal and a Pinkerton informant, took practically all the family's food and blankets without any kind of repayment. It was this type of behavior and the general resentment of the large railroads and wealthy ranchers that explains why outlaws like Cassidy and his gang often received aid from small ranchers and other folk. It's also why myths were built up about them, as even if they didn't do the full Robin Hood of actually sharing the money with the people, they were still at the very least seen as better than the lawmen and the rich men and corporations that they protected. In the end, then, what amounted to one of the largest manhunts ever organized in Wyoming still failed to capture the bandits. That being said, with the authorities fairly confident that members of Butch Cassidy's gang had been involved in the heist, even though none seemed to actually match his description, newspapers across the country soon featured a picture of Cassidy that was based upon the mugshot that had been taken of him during his time in the Wyoming State Penitentiary. As a result, Butch Cassidy suddenly became somewhat of a known entity nationwide. Which, you know, is not exactly a great thing if you're an outlaw. The world was starting to change. No longer could you commit a crime in one territory or state, and once the heat there got to be a bit too much, all you had to do was simply move on to another region where they had no idea about you or your past. A situation that is notably depicted in Red Dead Redemption 2, as the Vanderlyn gang are never quite able to escape their crimes and are constantly being hunted down. Also complicating matters for Cassidy's Wild Bunch were the main antagonists for Red Dead Redemption, the Pinkertons. Most notably, one of their top men, a 12-year veteran with the company Charles Siringo, had been dispatched to hunt down the outlaws. Originally hailing from Texas, Siringo had not liked the work the Pinkertons had him doing in the city. He saw himself more as a kind of cowboy detective, so this job of pursuing the likes of Butch Cassidy and his gang was much more to Siringo's liking. Indeed, Siringo seemed to be quite good at this cowboy detective thing, as he was not only a capable tracker, but he was also comfortable working undercover, a skill he used to infiltrate gangs and eventually unions, a job he would later claim to have detested. As such, even though Siringo would eventually turn on the Pinkertons, revealing a number of their illegal and underhanded tactics, for a time he was highly valued by William Pinkerton himself. In this particular case, Siringo would pick up the trail of the various outlaws by tracing the unique banknotes that had been taken from the train. You see, among the contents of the express car were what was considered incomplete currency, as they had not been signed. Additionally, not only were the serial numbers of these unsigned bills known, but many had also suffered distinctive damage to their corners due to the large explosion the bandits had employed to gain entrance to the safe. All of which made these bills quite recognizable and thus easy to track when they started appearing in various cities in Utah, Colorado, and New Mexico. Siringo then traveled to each and every location where these bills showed up, getting the description of the individuals who had cashed these banknotes. Through this information, the Pinkertons were able to identify several of the robbers, and thus came close to capturing them a few times before ultimately losing the trail. Yet, while Siringo would come up empty, some other Pinkerton agents would have a bit more luck, when some of the very traceable banknotes were deposited in a bank in Harlem, Montana. Bills which had initially been flagged due to the torn corners from the explosion, and when they were sent on for further examination, their serial numbers confirmed they had been taken during the train robbery. The individuals who had deposited these bills were then identified as the owners of the Curry Brothers Saloon right there in Harlem, Montana, Lonnie Logan and his cousin Bob Lee. Now, the outlaws, one way or another, realized they had slipped up when they tried depositing those banknotes, and so by the time the Pinkerton agents had identified them, the two men had already sold their saloon and left town. Unfortunately for the outlaws, the Pinkertons were still about to quickly track them down. The end of the trail for the two cousins came on the 28th of February, when Bob Lee was easily captured in Cripple Creek, where he had taken a job dealing faro, while Lonnie Logan would be killed when the Pinkertons tracked him down to his aunt and uncle's home in Dodson, Missouri. Lonnie, while visiting with his relatives, would notice some men sneaking up on the house, and so he tried to escape through the back door, at which point the Pinkertons shot and killed him. With the heat clearly on, a number of the outlaws who had been involved in the robbery opted to keep a low profile for the time being. Butch Cassidy, for example, kept up appearances as he continued working his job on the WS Ranch for Jim Lowe. His friend Elsie Lay, who had also joined him working on the ranch-breaking Broncos, however, would soon leave that job in June, claiming as he did so that since all the ranch's Broncos were broken, there was no other work there that he was interested in doing. Which probably wasn't strictly true, as it seems that Elsie's real reason for leaving was because he was planning to rob a train. As in about a month, Elsie and 3 other men held up a Colorado and Southern train near Folsom, New Mexico. A job that might have been planned by Cassidy, seeing as how his original name for the Wild Bunch was the Train Robbers Syndicate. Regardless, Elsie and the men involved didn't do a great job in making sure they got away this time, as apparently the outlaws made the mistake of starting a fire while they were still being hunted by the law. In doing so, the smoke from their fire led the posse right to their location. As the lawmen rode up to where the outlaws had camped, they may or may not have ordered the men in question to surrender. Yet, regardless of whether the lawmen actually made this offer or not, it does not sound like they actually gave the outlaws a chance to surrender, but instead pretty much immediately started shooting, which resulted in Elsie, who had been walking to the nearby creek to fill his canteen at the time, getting hit in his shoulder and back as the shooting started. Meanwhile, the other outlaws were responding in kind. As they started firing back, the sheriff who was leading the posse and another man then tried ducking behind the same tree, which, as it turns out, was not big enough for 2 men to hide behind. As a result, both men would be shot, one in his arm near his wrist and the other in his calf. The sheriff then attempted to bind his wounded arm, yet in doing so he exposed himself and was then shot in the chest, killing him instantly. The death of the sheriff, along with several other members of the posse being wounded, convinced them to back off, which then allowed the bandits to escape. However, Elsie and another of the outlaws had been wounded during the firefight, and so they couldn't exactly travel far or fast. As a result, it wasn't long before they were arrested and Elsie was charged with the murder of the sheriff, even though there was no evidence that he had been the one who had fired the fatal shot. Indeed, given the fact that Elsie had been shot twice in the opening moments of the gun battle, it seems unlikely that he was the one who had killed the sheriff. Still, the state wanted to send a message, and so Elsie was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Meanwhile, a Pinkerton detective named Frank Murray started poking around Elsie's former place of work, the WS Ranch, during which time Murray shared with William French a series of photographs, wanting to know if he recognized any of the men in them. As it turned out, French was able to identify one of the men in the pictures as his trusted foreman Jim Lowe, who the Pinkerton agent subsequently informed him was none other than Butch Cassidy, the suspected head of one of the most well-organized and enterprising groups of outlaws in the annals of the American West. Now, Cassidy himself was not actually on the ranch when this exchange took place. However, when he did return, French would inform him of the interesting conversation he'd had with the Pinkerton agent. If French was expecting any kind of fear or alarm at this news, quote-unquote, Jim Lowe did not give it. Instead, Jim just smiled and informed French that he was very much aware of the Pinkerton agent. Indeed, the two had shared a drink shortly before Jim had returned to the ranch. The thing that Cassidy didn't share with French was, as Murray would later tell it, the outlaw had in some way saved the Pinkerton's life in the bar that night that they met. In doing so, Murray promised to stay silent about where Cassidy was hiding and what name he was using as a cover. Still, though, he likely warned the outlaw that there were other Pinkertons out there looking for him. Cassidy then would eventually leave the WS ranch behind, as it was clear that French was at least somewhat conflicted with the knowledge that he had a known and wanted outlaw working for him, as even if French didn't seem personally inclined to turn him in, he still didn't relish the trouble that came along with harboring a known outlaw. The news was beginning to close in around Butch Cassidy and outlaws like him. As a result, he gave some serious thought to giving up the life and going straight. Yet if he was going to do so, Cassidy was going to need some assurances that the law would not continue to pursue him, which is what brought him to Salt Lake City and the office of Orlando Powers, an influential and well-connected lawyer, who was likely quite surprised when this man came in and began explaining to him that his name was Butch Cassidy and he had a quote-unquote heap of charges against him, not to mention a significant amount of money in rewards for his capture, all of which had made his life miserable. Cassidy was tired of hiding and being constantly on the run. He was then looking for some kind of deal where he could just surrender and face charges for only one of his crimes, or maybe even get a pardon of some sort. The problem, as Powers saw it, though, was Cassidy had, quote, robbed too many big corporations. Corporations that he believed would not be interested in forgiving and forgetting. The lawyer's only recommendation then was Cassidy was going to have to stay on the run. Disappointed but not completely discouraged, Butch next sought out the aid and advice of an old family friend, Parley P. Christensen, who at the time was the sheriff of Juab County in Utah. Christensen then essentially put his own career on the line as he reached out on Cassidy's behalf to Governor Wells, looking to set up a meeting between the two men. Surprisingly, the governor actually agreed to this meeting, possibly because he was impressed that the lawman was hanging himself out like that. The meeting in question then apparently went fairly well, as Governor Wells agreed to look into some kind of amnesty for Cassidy, providing that he had no murder charges against him, with Cassidy assuring the governor that he had never killed anyone. What Cassidy likely didn't know then was there had been a killing in Wyoming that he had been blamed for. So, even though Cassidy would assure the governor that he had not committed that crime, there was nothing the governor could do for him. Plus, there was also the fact that even if Wells granted him some kind of pardon, that would only have solved Cassidy's problems with the authorities in Utah, leaving him still vulnerable to charges from states like Wyoming, Colorado, and anywhere else he was wanted. So it seemed that there was no hope for Cassidy, except lawyer Orlando Powers had not forgotten about the problems the outlaw had introduced him to. Indeed, even though he had advised Cassidy that there was nothing he could do, Powers had subsequently come up with a bit of a plan. You see, train robberies had become something of an epidemic in the country, what with 261 of them taking place in the last 9 years alone. Crimes that had led to injuries for 86 individuals and had cost another 88 their lives. It seemed to Powers then that the railroads, the Union Pacific in particular, should have a vested interest in taking a capable criminal like Butch Cassidy out of the game by any means. In Powers' mind then, if hunting down criminals like Cassidy was proving so difficult, why not try a different tactic? Like, for example, calling off the proverbial dogs, in exchange for Cassidy and his gang agreeing to put an end to their careers as outlaws. In fact, Cassidy might even potentially be employed by the railroad to act as a further deterrent against other train robbers. an offer that the Union Pacific officials were at the very least willing to consider. And so Powers set up a meeting between the two sides, with Cassidy's longtime confidant and legal representative Douglas Preston agreeing to escort the Union Pacific officials personally. The meeting was then set to take place at Lost Soldier Pass, a desolate, isolated location near the Wyoming and Utah border, a location likely chosen so that if things went south during the negotiations, Butch could easily ride off and disappear into the surrounding wilderness. This meeting, however, would never happen, as Butch was left waiting for hours on end at Lost Soldier Pass, growing progressively more nervous and upset as he did, until finally fearing some kind of double cross, he departed and in doing so, left behind a note under a rock that read, quote, "Damn you, Preston, you have double-crossed me. I waited all day but you didn't show up. Tell the UP to go to hell and you can go with them." Yet what Butch did not know was there was no actual double-cross in play. Instead, Preston and the railroad officials had been delayed not due to scheming, but due to a terrible storm that kept their train from departing on time. Powers and the Union Pacific officials then were still determined to try and make this deal happen. Indeed, they even reached out to one of Cassidy's former compatriots, Matt Morter, who had just been released from prison as a result of the gunfight he had been involved in while working for prospector E.B. Coleman. The Union Pacific officials then provided Warner with travel expenses so he could reach Cassidy and explain the situation. However, even before Warner could reach his old friend, he would receive a telegram informing him that the deal was off. As you see, it's generally believed that Cassidy personally, along with several members of his gang, on the 29th of August 1900, had taken part in a robbery of a Union Pacific train near a location known either as Table Rock or Pulpit Rock. The robbery had likely started near the town of Tipton, Wyoming, where the bandits had potentially boarded the train. Everything then had seemed normal for the train's crew, until one of the outlaws had climbed into the train's compartment. The outlaw then shoved his gun into the engineer's ribs and ordered him to slowly pull the train to a stop when he saw a campfire sitting alongside the tracks. As waiting by the campfire were three more outlaws, who, like they had with the Wilcox job, had the train crew disconnect the passenger cars from the engine, the mail and express cars. With this done, the outlaws then had the engine pull the cars they cared about a ways down the track, thereby leaving the passengers behind and unmolested. Behavior which again feeds into the outlaw mythos that Cassidy's gang had no interest in robbing and terrorizing the regular passengers, as their real target was primarily the wealth being shipped by the railroad and the various corporations in the express cars. Speaking of, when they came to said express car, the man inside refused to open the door when they demanded he do so. So, like they had done in the past whenever presented with this particular obstacle, the outlaws attached dynamite to the side of the car. But before they lit the fuse, they reportedly gave the man inside one last chance to open the door before they set off the explosive, at which point, much to their surprise, the door actually opened. But even more surprising was the face of the man who opened the door. As you see, the man inside the express car was none other than Charles E. Woodcock, the same individual who had been in the car they had blown open in their previous robbery near Wilcox, Wyoming, which also explains why he had no interest in living through that particular experience again, as he knew that the robbers had the means to get in regardless of his actions. Indeed, the last time he had refused, he had been launched back, cracking his head against the safe. Plus, he knew they weren't always exactly perfect when it came to dynamite, as when blowing up the safe in that robbery, they had very nearly destroyed the entire car. This time, though, they would use the right amount of dynamite when blowing up the safes, allowing them to steal somewhere in the neighborhood of $55,000. Although the railroad would claim they'd only stolen some $50, as all they had made off with were a couple packages of cheap jewelry. That claim, however, is more than likely a lie, put out by the railroad to not make themselves look bad, and to also try and discourage other robberies. Meanwhile, a pair of posses would be formed to pursue the fleeing train robbers. Numbering over 40 men combined, the posse soon picked up the outlaws' trail and took up the chase. Yet the longer the pursuit took, the more of a toll it took on their mounts, some of whom weren't really fit for this kind of work, and were only being ridden because the posses had been formed in such haste. As a result, the posse's numbers started to dwindle bit by bit, as some couldn't keep up, while others couldn't carry on, period. Indeed, by the time they finally spotted the outlaws riding up the side of a hill on the other side of a lake, only 12 men remained, and these men had been awake for some 20 hours at that point. As such, with night falling, even though they were finally drawing close to their quarry, they had no real other choice but to halt their pursuit temporarily to try and get some much-needed rest so they could pick up the chase the next morning. Come the dawn, it appeared as if they had made the right choice, as the 12 remaining men easily found the outlaws' trail and were soon in pursuit once again. In fact, along the way, they came across a horse laying dead alongside the trail that likely had been ridden to exhaustion by their quarry, a sure sign they had to be close now, and indeed up ahead the track led into a thick grove of willow trees, which was both good and bad news. Surely they had caught up to the outlaws, who were now hiding trapped in that grove. Yet at the same time, it was also a perfect spot for them to have set up an ambush for the posse. With that in mind, the remaining members of the posse encircled the grove and began slowly and cautiously moving in, as they anticipated gunfire to erupt from the trees at any moment. Yet as they got closer and closer, there was no gunfire as there were no outlaws. This, as it turns out, was not an ambush site. It was simply one of the places where they had stashed a fresh relay of horses, meaning that not only were the bandits long gone by now, but they also had fresh horses, unlike the members of the posse. Realizing then that they had no hope of catching up with the outlaws, the posse turned around and headed home on the 19th of September 1900. The authorities at this point assumed that the outlaws were heading back to one of their favorite hideouts in Browns Park. Yet just 3 weeks later, 3 men believed to have been Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kid, and Will News Carver were involved in a bank robbery in Winnemucca, Nevada. The trio had started the day off by visiting the town saloon, during which time, according to a Pinkerton informant, News in particular stood out, as he had apparently had a run-in with a skunk earlier that morning and was still suffering from the ill effects of that encounter. Regardless of the pervading smell around News Carver, the trio, after leaving the saloon, tied their horses up by the F.C. Robbins Mercantile Store that just happened to be located directly behind the town's First National Bank, a bank that openly advertised in the newspaper that they consistently had $82,000 worth of capital on hand, a boast designed to make customers comfortable with doing business with them, as they had no need to fear the bank not having their money on hand should they need to withdraw for any reason. At the same time, though, it obviously also made the bank a tempting target for outlaws like Butch Cassidy and his gang. At noon, then, the 3 men entered the bank without masks and ordered the only customer and the bank's 4 employees, the head cashier, his assistant, the bank's bookkeeper, and a stenographer, to put their hands in the air and stand against the wall. Or, to be more precise, they ordered everyone inside to do so with the exception of the head cashier, who they instead commanded to retrieve all the bags of gold coins out of the vault. At this, the cashier insisted that the vault was time-locked and there was no way he could open it at this moment, a claim that didn't make any sense given that it was noon on a business day. There was simply no way that a bank in those days would ever have their vault locked at such a time. One of the outlaws then responded to this blatant lie by placing the blade of a knife to the man's throat, at which point the cashier promptly opened the vault and took out from it 3 bags of gold coins worth about $5,000 each. The bandits then stuffed the coins and the cash that was in the bank's drawers into the sacks they had brought with them, making their haul altogether to be somewhere in the neighborhood of $30,000. Once they had what they had come for, the bandits then marched the 5 individuals in the bank out the back door, which led into a fenced-in yard behind the building. At which point, as one of the robbers kept his guns trained on the 5 civilians, 2 of the bandits hopped over the fence and mounted the horses they had left in the alley. The final robber then waited for his companions to mount up and secure their haul. When he was sure they were ready to go, the final outlaw then vaulted the fence, joining them, and soon all 3 were riding off, $30,000 richer after having spent less than 5 minutes in the bank. Meanwhile, as soon as they were alone, the head cashier ran back into the bank. Inside, the cashier grabbed a revolver and then ran out the front door into the street where he began firing his weapon. He did not shoot at the fleeing outlaws, however, but instead he shot up into the air so as to alert the town of what had just occurred. At the same time as this was happening, the lone customer who had been in the bank had his own ideas, as when he ran out into the street, he grabbed another man's shotgun and began taking aim at the fleeing thieves. The shotgun, however, was either not loaded and he did absolutely nothing, or in another version of the story, the gun was loaded, but all he managed to shoot with it was a nearby window. Either way, his efforts were ineffective. Meanwhile, as a result of the head cashier raising the alarm, a deputy sheriff dashed up a nearby windmill where he took aim at the fleeing bandits with his rifle. He then fired a pair of shots as they rode out of town, but by that point, they were already too far gone. The deputy, however, noted that the outlaws were riding along a road that paralleled the railroad tracks. The deputy then ran back to the station where he gathered a train crew and ordered them to get a locomotive together so they could pursue the criminals that way. Soon the deputy and the train crew were barreling down the rails at full speed. They quickly then caught up with the fleeing bank robbers, thereby allowing the deputy to once again attempt to fire upon the outlaws. Yet the tracks in the road, even though they ran parallel to one another, were still separated by too great of a distance for this to be effective. As this showy but ultimately pointless attempt was being made, word was wired onto the next town alerting the local lawmen there that the outlaws were heading their way. The lawmen then gathered up a posse and rode out planning to head the bandits off. However, by the time the lawman got his people in position at the location he planned to wait for the bandits, Cassidy and his men, who had ridden faster than the lawman had anticipated, were already long gone. As a result, the outlaws and their relay of fresh horses that allowed them to consistently ride at top speed soon outdistanced their pursuers once again. Now, there is some dispute as to whether Cassidy and his wild bunch were actually responsible for both of these robberies, seeing as how the men who had robbed the bank in Nevada had arrived in town on the 9th of September, about a week after the train robbery near Tipton, Wyoming, a distance that was likely too far to cover on horseback during that span of time. That being said, the authorities had lost track of the Wyoming train robbers not all that far away from where they could have boarded a train, which would have cut down on their travel time considerably. Indeed, writer Richard Patterson suggests that if the authorities at the time were under the assumption that the outlaws were going to ground in Browns Park, they might not have been paying close attention to the train stations, which would have then allowed Cassidy and his crew to board a train and travel to the site of their next robbery to begin scouting the area. At the very least, it does seem likely that Cassidy participated in the bank robbery in Nevada, as the camp where the outlaws stayed during their time scouting and planning the bank heist had been frequently visited by a 10-year-old boy named Vic Button. Young Vic, you see, was curious about these strangers, and in particular the fast horses that they rode. Vic then would attest that these men were the infamous Butch Cassidy and two members of his gang, as he had spoken with Butch specifically on multiple occasions. Indeed, when Cassidy wasn't asking the boy questions about the local area, the town, and its bank, he was racing the lad on horseback, with Butch's fast white horse beating the boys each time. Vic very much admired that white horse, and even told Butch as much one day, to which Cassidy responded, quote, "You like that horse? Someday he will be yours." And indeed, when the outlaws switched mounts while fleeing after the robbery, Cassidy left word with the cowboy who had been paid to wait with the fresh mounts that he was to take his white horse and give it to 10-year-old Vic Button, who he had promised it to. Also attesting to the claim that it was none other than Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid who committed the bank robbery in Nevada was an account published in an Argentinian newspaper in 1912, the story supposedly consisting of Sundance's personal account of that particular robbery. Yet regardless of whether or not Butch, Sundance, and other members of their gang were responsible for both or neither of these robberies, both crimes were ultimately laid at their feet, as following the train robbery near Tipton, Wyoming, bounties of a minimum of $10,000 were placed on the bandits' heads to be brought in dead or alive. At the same time, the Pinkertons were also hired, and they again put one of their best men on the job, Charles Siringo. Now, high on their list of suspects was Wild Bunch member Harvey Logan, who had reportedly vowed to continue robbing Union Pacific trains as a way of seeking vengeance for his brother Lonnie's death that had been the result of the railroad's pursuit of them. With signs then pointing to the involvement of Butch Cassidy in the robbery, Siringo was ordered to go check out Circle Valley, where Butch had grown up while he was still known as Bob Parker. Siringo's orders from his bosses in the Pinkertons was to learn as much as he could about the outlaw. He didn't find much, though. Most of what he came away with from this time was trivia about Cassidy's childhood. Really, it seems that the only somewhat pertinent piece of information he came away with was the knowledge that the gang made use of what's been termed blind post offices. Basically, there were a series of a kind of dead drop locations that consisted of hollow stumps, rocky crevices, and the like. Encrypted pieces of communication would then be deposited in one of these locations to be retrieved at a later date by another individual. Meanwhile, as the Pinkertons and various authorities were trying and largely failing to find any hint of where the outlaws had gone to, the Wild Bunch were heading for Fort Worth, Texas to relax and blow off some steam. which makes sense as Fort Worth at this time was a popular destination for cowboys after a long time on the trail. Fort Worth, you see, was an important transportation center, as it was the westernmost trailhead for shipping cattle. Indeed, the cattle industry's dependence upon the location had created a boom time for the city. Fort Worth then saw an incredible growth both in population and wealth due to the cattle industry. As a result, it quickly became a modernized city, earning it the title of the Paris of the Plains. The city boasted streetcars and electric lights. In fact, you could also see on its streets some early automobiles, something which further hinted at the changing world as the days of horses and cowboys were starting to come to an end. Yet even with the future staring them in the face, cowboys were still very much helping to fuel the city's economic boom, as Fort Worth offered the cowboys not only an opportunity to purchase supplies, but also their last chance to have some fun before they set off on the 1,500-mile-long dusty and dangerous Chisholm Trail that led north from the city. The main attraction for these cowboys then was the city's Tenderloin District, more commonly known as Hell's Half Acre, as it was the home of the city's 3 best sporting houses, a euphemism for brothels, in addition to being the site of any number of brawls, knife fights, muggings, and shootings, all of which was a result of cowboys with money to spend wanting to blow off some steam, and the kind of thieves, roughnecks, and confidence men who also congregated in such a location, looking to separate the cowboys from their hard-earned pay one way or another. This then was likely not the Wild Bunch's first visit to the city and its Hell's Half Acre, but this one was special, as Will News Carver was getting married to Callie Mae Hunt, aka Lily Davies, who had worked for Madame Fanny Porter in San Antonio. The wedding and the surrounding celebrations were likely a fancy affair. At the very least, 5 members of the gang, Butch, Sundance, Harvey Logan, Will News Carver, and Ben Kilpatrick, all got dressed up on the 21st of November. The 5 outlaws in their suits and derby hats looked more like merchants or bankers than the types of people who normally rob said merchants and bankers. They looked so good, in fact, that the 5 paid a visit to the studio of prominent Fort Worth photographer John Swartz. Now, we cannot say what their exact motivations for this visit were. They might have, like I already suggested, simply been impressed by how good they looked. Others, meanwhile, have suggested that they were purposely mocking the rich people they liked to rob by dressing up like them. Or again, it could have been something as simple as they wanted something to share with their friends, or they could have wanted a memento of that time. After all, by this point, the idea that Butch and Sundance may be putting their outlaw days behind them and retiring to a quiet life elsewhere was probably already in the air. If that was the case, they all would have known that their days together were coming to an end, and they wanted this photo to help them remember this final hurrah they had together. Regardless, this photograph would prove to be an extremely bad idea. You see, none of them ordered the standard tin-type copies of the photo. Instead, they all requested the more expensive 6.5 by 8.5 inch prints made using the new and cutting-edge dry-plane method. Now, the prints that Swartz made using this technique came out especially well. So well, in fact, that unbeknownst to the gang members, Swartz was so proud of this particular work, he made an extra print to hang in the front window of his gallery as a kind of advertisement for the kind of work he was capable of. Yet, while this photo might have been intended to act as an advertisement for Swartz in his studio, some individual whose identity seems to have been lost to time happened to spot the picture in question, and in doing so, recognized at least some of the men in it. Now, legend credits this discovery to one Fred Dodge, a famous special agent for Wells Fargo. However, he would make no reference to this, you would assume, fairly momentous event in his memoirs, suggesting that he was not actually the person who noticed the photo and recognized its importance. Regardless, someone saw the photo sitting in the front of the shop, and recognizing who was in it, realized that this was the best photo they had gotten on the members of Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch. This individual then, whoever they might have been, then had additional prints made that they then passed on to private detectives like those employed by Wells Fargo and the Pinkertons, as well as other more legitimate lawmen as well. As a result, lawmen across the United States now had for the first time quality photos of individuals they quickly identified as Butch Cassidy's Sundance Kid, Harvey Logan, Ben Kilpatrick, and Will Carver. This image was then used to produce wanted posters for each man that were then distributed across the West. Indeed, it was reportedly this photo that was sent to the Winnemucca Bank in Nevada so the cashier there could identify them as the men who had robbed the bank. Also, as a part of this flurry of activity surrounding the discovery of this photograph, various lawmen, detectives for Wells Fargo, and the Pinkertons all descended upon Fort Worth, looking for members of the Wild Bunch. Yet by the point these myriad forces arrived and started turning the city and its hell's half-acre upside down, the outlaws had already long departed. However, even though they had once again eluded their pursuers, the days of Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kid, and the Wild Bunch were coming to an end. Indeed, the days of outlaws in general in the American West were almost over. That being said, the forces behind the stage and the ways in which Butch and Sundance in particular responded will be the subject of our next and final episode on this topic. Until then, though, it will have to remain a story for another time. Thank you for listening to Distorted History. If you would like to help out, please rate and review the podcast and tell your friends if you think they'll be interested. If you're feeling especially generous and would like to help keep this podcast going, please consider visiting my Ko-fi page at ko-fi.com/distortedhistory and donating a few bucks. Anything you can give is greatly appreciated. I will be posting updates on future episodes and sources there in addition to posting them on Twitter as I usually do. With all that being said, once again, thank you for listening, and until next time.